Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.54 The Babylonian Conquest of Judah. First, just a note that if you ever get confused about all the kings and dates I mention here, you can find handy-dandy charts and timelines at my site, www.historyinthebible.com. That's all one word, History in the Bible. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, we left King Josiah of Judah triumphantly celebrating Passover. Josiah met his inglorious end shortly after his great national Passover. In 610 BC, the last holdouts of the Assyrian army were in dire straits at Haran, in their great struggle against, well, just about everyone. Assyria's good friend, Pharaoh Necho II, sent a great relief force to their aid. But the Assyrians were punch-drunk and on their last legs. Really, Necho could do little to help them. The Egyptians had been exploiting Assyrian weakness in the Levant for a decade, all the while pretending otherwise. Necho's northern march was a cover to enable him to re-establish Egypt's dominion over its long-lost provinces in the Levant. It was also a side bet, just in case the Assyrians prevailed, as they had done so often before. From the account in Kings, pro-Babylonian Josiah met Necho at the strategically important site of Megiddo, located in the middle of the old northern kingdom of Israel. Kings then simply and cryptically records that Necho killed him. In Chronicles, the confrontation is a military one. The Egyptians crushed him like a bug. The chronicler blames Josiah for his own death, for he failed to understand that Necho was working for God. Quote, 2 Chronicles 35:20. King Necho of Egypt came up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. Necho sent messages to him saying, "What have I to do with you, King of Judah? I do not march against you this day, but against the kingdom that wars with me, and it is God's will that I hurry. Refrain then from interfering with God who is with me, that he not destroy you." End quote. Josiah had blundered by supporting a distant Babylon, who could give him no aid, against a neighbouring Egypt who could inflict great harm. The Judeans had been hopeless at international diplomacy for generations. They bungled yet again, trying to work out who would be their best mate. Josiah was dead. The same people of the land, the great landholders, who had placed Josiah on the throne, now elevated his 20-something-year-old son, Jehoahaz II. That's pronounced probably something like Jehoahaz, also called Shalom. Josiah's elder sons were set aside. Like his father, Jehoahaz also favoured Babylon over Egypt. Yet Necho II's great army was still encamped to his north. What was he thinking? The Pharaoh had failed in his mission to save the Assyrians from the Babylonians. He fell back to Egypt, unable to press his point, but sure that the Babylonians did not have the power to press theirs. On his return journey, Necho deposed and exiled the upstart Jehoahaz, who had enjoyed a scant 3 months on the throne. Just to make his point that from now on Judah would be run the way Egypt wanted, Necho imposed a modest fine of 100 talents of silver and 1 of gold. The prophet Jeremiah, who detested the Egyptians, lamented Jehoahaz's exile. Quote, Jeremiah 22:10. Do not weep for the dead, and do not lament for him, Weep rather for him who is leaving, for he shall never come back to see the land of his birth. For thus said the Lord concerning Shallum, son of King Josiah of Judah, who succeeded his father Josiah as king, but who has gone forth from this place. He shall never come back. He shall die in the place to which he was exiled, and he shall not see this land again. End quote. Jeremiah is one of the major prophets, along with Isaiah and Ezekiel. Christians add Daniel to those. His name means something like God will rise or Yahweh exalts. Jeremiah prophesied for 40 years, from the middle of Josiah's reign, through the reigns of another 4 kings, to the very end of the monarchy and into the exile. His big takeaway is that God has doomed Judah to be swallowed by Babylon. Don't even think of resisting. Don't even think of asking the Egyptians for help. We're all doomed, I tell you. The holy city of Jerusalem shall be destroyed. In that he agrees with the prophet Micah, but opposes the prophet Isaiah. Jeremiah and Micah won that argument. Jeremiah's message was odious. The natural sympathies of the Judeans lay with Egypt. They had traded with the land of the Nile for centuries. They had sought refuge there in times of drought. They had established a colony on the island of Elephantine in the Nile, at Egypt's southernmost border. Even the book of Deuteronomy had a good word for Egypt, letting slide that whole 400 years of slavery thing. Babylon was a distant and unfamiliar power, barely on the geopolitical horizon. For all his unpopularity with people and king, Jeremiah still had important friends at court. The prophet had deep connections with Josiah's reform movement. In episode 1.53, Evil King Manasseh, I mentioned how the scribe Shaphan brought a newly discovered scroll of the teaching to King Josiah. It was Shaphan's sons who rescued the wayward prophet from many a tight spot. Necho replaced Jehoahaz with Eliakim, another son of the righteous Josiah. The new king took the throne name of Jehoiakim, or Jehoiakim, in 609 BC, and would reign for 10 years. Jeremiah hated Jehoiakim with the same passion he hated the Egyptians, and with the same passion he welcomed the coming Babylonian takeover. He called for the king's assassination, but got no takers. In a passage known as the Temple Sermon, Jeremiah lets fly with God's denunciation. Quote, Jeremiah 7:3. Thus said Yahweh of hosts, mind your ways and your actions, and I will let you dwell in this place. No, if you really mend your ways and your actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan and the widow, if you do not follow other gods to your own hurt, then only I will let you dwell in this place. Will you steal and murder and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and sacrifice to Baal, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe? Safe to do all those abhorrent things? End quote. The king, says the prophet, has returned to the idolatrous ways of old. Against Isaiah's sunny optimism that God will protect the holy city and the holy temple, Jeremiah runs around screaming that doom, doom, doom. The city is doomed. The temple is doomed. God wants Babylon to destroy us. No one wanted to hear this. According to chapter 26 of Jeremiah, the prophet barely made it out of Jerusalem alive, with the connivance of his friends in high places. Jeremiah was banned from the temple, banned from speaking, barely able to enter the land. He sent his scribe Baruch with another inflammatory scroll to King Jehoiakim. The king burnt it. In the Catholic canon, Baruch gets his own book. I'll talk about that in a later episode. Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, was doomed to live in interesting times. When he was very young, he would have known the fear of living in the dark shadows of Assyrian power. He was unexpectedly elevated to the throne during the brief 15 years in which Egypt again controlled the Levant, between the Assyrian and Babylonian dominations. Jehoiakim was Necho's man on the Judean throne. Like most of the Judean population, he hoped that Egypt could still serve as a guarantor of Judean freedoms. Only a few years into his reign, in 605 BC, the Egyptians were smashed by Nebuchadnezzar, the crown prince of Babylon, at the Battle of Carchemish on the border of modern Turkey and Syria. The remnants of the Egyptian army were decimated while fleeing Syria for the Nile. Even as Necho's army was bolting back to Egypt, King Jehoiakim never wavered in his hope that the Pharaoh would save his kingdom from the Babylonians, steadily marching down the coast. Nebuchadnezzar took the important Philistine city of Ashkelon, only 60 kilometres from Jerusalem. As Nebuchadnezzar happily wrote back home, "I turned the city into a mound and heaps of ruins." The Babylonian chronicles candidly report that in 601 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and Necho clashed on the Egyptian border. That battle left Egypt in command of the field. Emboldened by the Babylonian defeat, Jehoiakim raised the standard of rebellion by refusing to pay tribute to faraway Babylon. That turned out to be yet another of Judah's diplomatic blunders. Nebuchadnezzar regrouped. He marched again on Egypt in 597 BC. On the way he casually besieged and took Jerusalem. For a fifth time, the treasures of the temple, so assiduously accumulated by David and Solomon, were pillaged. It is not clear if Jehoiakim died before the Babylonian victory, or if he was captured by the Babylonians. Some versions of the Septuagint have the books of Kings and Chronicles, reporting that Jehoiakim was buried in Jerusalem. Jehoiakim may have been dead, or he may have been in captivity in Babylon. We don't really know. He left his 18-year-old son, Jehoiakim, in charge. He's also known as Coniah or Jeconiah. I'm going to call him Jeconiah because it's just so much easier to pronounce. Jeconiah reigned for a puny 3 months in 597 BC. He was the puppet ruler of little more than the city of Jerusalem, surrounded by Babylonian armies. Perhaps the Babylonians installed Jeconiah just so that they could receive a formal surrender. Kings reports with great sadness, quote, 2 Kings 24:9. Jeconiah did what was displeasing to the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time the troops of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon marched against Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. Thereupon King Jeconiah of Judah, along with his mother and his courtiers, commanders, and officers, surrendered to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon took him captive. He carried off from Jerusalem all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He stripped off all the golden decorations in the temple of the Lord. He exiled all of Jerusalem, all the commanders and all the warriors, 10,000 exiles, as well as all the craftsmen and smiths. Only the poorest people in the land were left. He deported Jeconiah to Babylon, and the king's wives and officers and the notables of the land were brought as exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the able men, to the number of 7,000, all of them warriors trained for battle, and 1,000 craftsmen and smiths were brought to Babylon as exiles by the king of Babylon. End quote. Thus began the first of the Judean deportations to Babylon. The exile had begun. In Babylon, Jeconiah lived in some style. One Babylonian tablet we have says, quote, "To Jehoiakim, king of the land of Yehuda, 26 pints of oil for Jehoiakim, king of the land of Yehuda, 33¼ pints for the 5 sons of the king of the land of Yehuda, 6 pints for 8 men, Yehudians, for each one 1¾ of a pint, by the hand of Kanama the scribe." End quote. Jeconiah lived so well that he prospered for decades in Babylon. According to the Book of Kings, he was released from confinement by Nebuchadnezzar's son more than 30 years after his capture. Jeconiah's uncle, good King Josiah's last son Zedekiah, Zedekiah, was placed on the throne by his Babylonian overlords. His original name was Mattaniah. He would be the last king of Judah. The capture of Jerusalem and King Jeconiah had stunned the inhabitants of the holy city. Some believe it was just a momentary aberration, that God would restore the city to its fortunes. The exiled Jeconiah would return in glory. To those, Zedekiah was a false king, a dupe of the Babylonian oppressors. Early in Zedekiah's reign, the regional leaders of the Levant, including Judah, called a conclave to discuss plans against Babylon. Judah's foreign policy had proven inept for decades, always picking the loser, vacillating between Egypt and whoever was to the north. Zedekiah provided one final act of idiocy. His father Josiah had supported Babylon against Assyria and Egypt. Zedekiah now decided to oppose Babylon and hope that Egypt would join him. I know, it gets complicated. Jeremiah, ever the foreign policy expert, was bitterly opposed. We must submit to Babylon and ignore Egypt. He dramatically illustrated his disapproval by parading around Jerusalem with a yoke of wood, then later a yoke of iron. This was a symbol of slavery, of the yoke of the master to come. Quote, Jeremiah 27:2. "Thus said Yahweh to me, Make for yourself thongs and bars of a yoke, and put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, and the king of Sidon, and give them this charge to their masters. Thus said Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, Say this to your masters, It is I who made the earth, and I give it to whomever I deem proper. I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The nation or kingdom that does not serve him and does not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will visit, declares Yahweh, with sword, famine, and pestilence, until I have destroyed it by his hands." End quote. Jeremiah prophesies Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. Nebuchadnezzar is an instrument of God's will. Quote, Jeremiah 27:12. "I spoke to King Zedekiah of Judah, Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Why should you and your people die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence, as Yahweh has spoken concerning any nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? Do not listen to the words of the prophets who are telling you not to serve the king of Babylon, for they are prophesying a lie to you. I have not sent them, says Yahweh, but they are prophesying falsely in my name, with the result that I will drive you out and you will perish." End quote. Jeremiah was repeatedly accused of treason, and with good cause. King Zedekiah threw Jeremiah into a pit, but soon regretted it. He released the mad old man back into the community. For all the 10 years of Zedekiah's reign, Jeremiah would repeatedly poke him with a burnt stick. When the nationalistic prophet Hananiah prophesied that Israel would be saved, Jeremiah proved that Hananiah was a false prophet. Long quote. Jeremiah 28:1. The prophet Hananiah said, "Thus said Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, I hereby break the yoke of the king of Babylon. In 2 years I will restore to this place all the vessels of the house of Yahweh, which King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took from this place and brought to Babylon. And I will bring back to this place King Jeconiah." The prophet Jeremiah said, "Amen. May Yahweh do so, but just listen to this word, which I address to you and to all the people. If a prophet prophesies good fortune, then only when the word of the prophet comes true can it be known that Yahweh really sent him." But the prophet Hananiah removed the bar from the neck of the prophet Jeremiah and broke it. The word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah. "Go say to Hananiah, Thus said Yahweh, you broke bars of wood, but you shall make bars of iron instead. For thus said Yahweh, I have put an iron yoke upon the necks of all those nations, that they may serve King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon." And the prophet Jeremiah said to the prophet Hananiah, "Listen, Hananiah, Yahweh did not send you, and you have given this people lying assurances. This year you shall die, for you have urged disloyalty to Yahweh." And the prophet Hananiah died that year. End quote. The conspirators from Judah, Moab, Edom, Ammon, and the Phoenician cities bade their time for a decade. They could do nothing without Egyptian support. Pharaoh Necho II had been burnt when he took on the Babylonians. After his defeat at Carchemish, he never brought an army north again. 6 years after Necho's defeat, Zedekiah, king of Judah, longed for Egypt's support. He found it in the new pharaoh Psammetichus II, who was looking for a fight with Babylon. Fresh from an easy victory over the Nubians to his south, Psammetichus paid a state visit to Judah. What he intended to accomplish, I have no idea. Thus emboldened, Zedekiah raised the standard of revolt by failing to pay tribute. He seems to have acted by himself, without his fellow Levantine conspirators. The Egyptians decided that absence was the better part of valour, and pretended to have no part in the rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar moved against his client state for a second time, in 589 BC. 8 years before, Nebuchadnezzar had captured Jerusalem, taken its king Jeconiah, and deported thousands. But he had spared the city, he had spared the temple, and he had left Judah to govern itself under a king of the line of David. Times had changed. The Egyptians were getting uppity. Nebuchadnezzar had to transform Judah from a client state with its own foreign policy to a dependent province. Judah was just collateral damage in a vigorous demonstration to remind Egypt to stay out of Babylon's business. Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city for 2 years before he breached its walls. He was in no mood for leniency this time. He burnt the temple and destroyed Jerusalem. The last sacred treasures of the temple were taken: the Ark of the Covenant, the Urim and Thummim, the holy oil, the sacred fire, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, and Aaron's rod. There are many ideas about what happened to that most sacred artifact of the Hebrews, the Ark of the Covenant. Americans say that Indiana Jones rescued it, and that it now resides in a vast Amazon fulfillment warehouse. The book of 2nd Maccabees, in the Catholic canon, says that Jeremiah placed it in the cave that holds the remains of Moses, at Mount Nebo. The book of 3rd Esdras, in the Orthodox canon, holds that the vessels of the ark were taken to Babylon, but says nothing about the ark itself. Rabbinic tradition is undecided. Perhaps it was taken to Babylon. Perhaps it was hidden by King Josiah. Perhaps it was buried somewhere on the Temple Mount. Perhaps it was concealed at Mount Nebo. The book of Jeremiah says that we are all on the wrong track. Quote, Jeremiah 3:16, And when you increase and are fertile in the land, in those days, declares the Lord, men shall no longer speak of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, nor shall it come to mind. They shall not mention it or miss it or make another. End quote. Nebuchadnezzar blinded Zedekiah, killed his sons, and took him to Babylon. There Zedekiah would have met his nephew Jeconiah, deported in Nebuchadnezzar's first capture 8 years before. When he greeted his uncle at the chariot station at Babylon Central, I'm sure Jeconiah was carrying a big "Told you so" sign. The Book of Kings had blamed evil King Manasseh for the downfall of the kingdom. Manasseh's reign was finished 50 years before Zedekiah's commenced. The chronicler did not believe in so long a delayed punishment. The chronicler blamed Zedekiah fair and square. Quote, 2 Chronicles 36:11. Zedekiah did what was displeasing to Yahweh his God. He did not humble himself before the prophet Jeremiah. He also rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. All the officers of the priests and the people committed many trespasses, following all the abominable practices of the nations. They polluted the house of Yahweh. They mocked the messages of God and disdained his words, and taunted his prophet. Yahweh therefore brought the king of the Chaldeans upon them. God did not spare youth, maiden, elder, or greybeard, but delivered all into his hands, all the vessels of the house of God, and the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and the treasures of the king and his officers were all brought to Babylon. They burned the house of God, and tore down the wall of Jerusalem, and consigned all its precious objects to destruction. Those who survived the sword he exiled to Babylon, and they became his servants till the rise of the Persian kingdom. End quote. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I tell the stories of the 4 prophets of the Babylonian crisis: Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. Thanks for listening.